So hello and welcome to our Early Start Research Seminar series. Today our focus is the ethics of working with children. I'm Lisa Curvin and I'm the Research Director here at Early Start. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that wherever we are in Australia, we're meeting on Aboriginal country. Today I'm at Early Start at UAW on Dharawal country. This country stretches from southern Sydney in our north to Nowra in our south. We have our beautiful escarpment in the west and the ocean in the east. I recognise the connection to the land and waters and thank Aboriginal people for protecting this coastline and ecosystems. Here at UAW, we are physically at the base of Mount Kira, an area that has always been a place of great knowledge and learning. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging and extend that respect to all Aboriginal people. So the purpose of this series is to focus on research methodologies specifically for early childhood researchers and to recognise and celebrate the expertise that we have within Early Start, the ASH faculty, UOW and our many external networks. So many have participated in previous seminars live and through our YouTube channel. And just a reminder that this session today will be recorded and uploaded as well. In our seminar today, we're focusing on the ethics of working with children. And to do this, we've put together quite an impressive panel. We have Dr. Karen Tonge, who's a lecturer in our School of Education and a very experienced early childhood educator, working with children, educators and communities throughout Australia. Her research interests are varied, but she's particularly interested in the physical environments for learning in the early years. We also have Associate Professor Stephen Howard, who has served on our UOW Ethics Committee and is currently an Ethics Advisor to the Australian Centre of Excellence for the Digital Child. His expertise is in educational psychology and is based in the School of Education. And he has lots of research experience looking at children's development, progress and needs, and really works hard to support children in their learning environments. And finally, on our panel today, we have Associate Professor Natascha Klocker, who's the current chair of the Human Ethics Committee here at UOW. And she has an enduring interest in children and young people's geographies. And we're really fortunate and grateful to have you with us too, Natascha. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Karen to start our conversations. I'll just stop my screen share, sorry team.
Okay, thank you. I'll just get my screen share. Okay, that's looking okay, I gather. Yep, great, thank you. It's always that nervousness of knowing what I'm seeing is what you're seeing and vice versa as well. So welcome everybody, and thank you, Lisa, for that very warm welcome. And I too would like to pay my respects as I'm sitting on Dharawal country today, just looking out and hearing the wind blowing and the beautiful sunshine coming through my window. So I certainly pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So today I've been invited to speak about some of my work with children, and it is a great pleasure to do so as well. So just some different points that I'll be working through today, and keeping in mind, I'm really basing this upon my personal experiences with my work and my research working in the early years. We'll be looking at some different considerations, some principles and practices of how I actually apply and approach work that I'm doing with children, either in consultation or in my research practices as well. I'll be looking at a framework that I use with a bit of a different tangent on a well-known framework. And I'll also be looking at some specific projects that I have worked on or I am actually working on at the moment. So just a little bit about myself. So I am a researcher and an academic in the early years program at UOW. I completed my PhD in 2019, and I was investigating the relationship between educator engagement and interaction and children's physical activity in early childhood education and care services. I have strong connections with Early Start and IMRI, and through this work, I've actually had different roles, such as an Early Start engagement centre coordinator, various consultancy roles and different projects also. More recently, I have also been involved in a number of community consultation projects in the wider community, and I have over 20 years experience working with children, families and within early childhood education and care services, within the University of Wollongong, and much broader as well. And of course, I'm proud to say I'm a mum of 3 teenage children as well, which has really informed a lot of my practice and pedagogy as well. And I think by having this different perspective and this very rich perspective, it's actually brought together a lot of the work that I do. And of course, I'm very lucky and I feel very fortunate to have one of the best jobs ever, which is working with and working for children. So before I start, I'd like to just acknowledge some of the people that I have worked with that have had such a great contribution in some of the research and projects that I've been involved in. So of course, all of the research teams that I have worked alongside, my PhD supervisors, Senior Professor Tony Oakley and Associate Professor Rachel Jones. I'd also like to acknowledge Bernardo's Communities for Children in Shellharbour City Council and Early Start. But of course, very importantly, the children, the families, the services and the communities that I've had the pleasure to actually work with as well. So when I do start any work with children, and particularly something that I do share in my academic work in pre-service teacher education, I like to really take a strong foundation of where do we go to, where do we look, where do we find best informed information about best practice, and what are our foundations of working with children going to be, and where are they going to come from? So I always look towards and remind others of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. So in particular, looking at Article 12, where children have the right to say what they think should happen when adults are making decisions that affect them, and to have their opinions taken into account. So by using this as a strong foundation in the work that we do, I think we're really establishing a strong sense of advocacy, but also respect and equity for the children that we're working with as well. I also look towards the New South Wales Child Safe Standards, and this is particularly relevant in some of the community work I'm doing, where we really look towards how are organisations ensuring that children are safe, children have a voice, and children feel safe in all domains of their learning and their development as well. So when we look at that document, we're looking at Standard 2 in particular, where we look at children participate in decisions affecting them and are taken seriously. Another document that I use in a lot of my work is the document that has been published by the Department of Education and Early Childhood Development in Victoria. And it's a consultation guide for engaging children in decision making. This is a very practical document where it really aligns some nice principles and practice of work that we are doing with children, and in particular, our ethical work with children and how we can be active partners in the work that we do. Alongside these main documents, it's really important when we are working with children and completing research with and for children is that we always ensure that children feel valued and valuable. Children as collaborative partners in research is really important, and we must always remember that children need to have a sense of space and place, and that they need to feel that their contribution is heard, that they are being actively listened to, and that they are valued in a way that they will perhaps see the fruits of the research coming back to them, or they'll see themselves in the space or the place, and that what they have actually contributed has been productive throughout their community or the school, the work that they do. Children also need to feel connected to the people that are working with them, perhaps the researchers and the research team that are working alongside them, but also connected to the place and space in which the research is occurring. For children to feel safe in the space where the programs, the research assistants are coming into, it will really enable a sense of security and the best possible outcomes, I suppose, for the research that's being conducted also. Children also need to feel empowered. They need to have the opportunity to add their ideas, add their suggestions, and really feel empowered in the processes of what is actually happening around them as well. In line with that, it's also to create a feeling of belonging and ownership, belonging in their voice, belonging in their work, a sense of ownership of their conversations, a sense of ownership and understanding of what they're being asked and what they're able to contribute to the particular projects. But also, and most importantly, we really need to value children as active citizens in the work that we do, and right from the age of birth, or right from birth to the age of 12 plus, children have a strong contribution, and this needs to be valued, and their voice really needs to be heard. So when we look at these particular principles, if we can base the work that we are doing with children and the research that we are doing alongside these goals, we've really established a really strong foundation for our research practices. So you may ask, how do we put all this into place? So a few key ideas that I often come back to when I'm designing research or designing consultation. I really like to create a safe place and space for the children. So it might be a place and space that they are familiar with. It might be a place and space that they just feel really comfortable with. It may be the people that are around them. It might be the people that are working with them. Or it might be just some familiar resources or equipment or facilities that are around them as well. It's also about time and timing. So we know that children are very good at leading their own play, at sometimes, leading and developing their own ways of doing things. And so being able and being very flexible and responsive to what is happening in that place and space, and being able to adjust your timing to suit how the flow of the discussion might be going, or how the flow of the activity is going as well. I often like to say we need to expect the unexpected when it comes to working with children, and particularly in the research that we do. Sometimes the answers aren't always going to be straightforward to us. However, if we are able and flexible to spend the time with children, this is going to be the most successful way of approaching the situations. We need to think of the communication that we use with children. How are we going to actively collaborate with children, and how are we going to ensure that our communication with them is most effective? This is about stepping into a child's perspective and thinking about, is it through images? Is it through the spoken word? Is it through drawings, through books? How are we best going to communicate with children? It's also about developing a trust and a rapport for children. And sometimes this takes time as well. So sometimes it's that pre-preparation before we start our research projects, by having time being with the children in their place and space, by visiting their preschool, by visiting their home. Developing that trusting relationship is actually really going to be helpful in what we do. Also having a playful approach. Children love play. Children learn through play. Play is a child's natural way of engaging with their world. So ensuring that our experiences and our research is aligned with playful experiences, we're going to get the best possible results from what we're trying to achieve. We also need to be active listeners in what the children are doing, and being responsive and watching for different cues. This is also about allowing children to be consenting partners in the research, and then providing the consent to continue with the activity, to continue with the questioning, to continue with the drawing activity, or whatever it might actually be. So sometimes it might be subtle. Children may not always express their uncertainty verbally, but watching for different cues and different body language as to when the time is right to step away, to step out, or to continue as well. But ultimately, it's about really thinking about the methods and strategies. What is the age group of the children that we're working with? Is my research design age appropriate? Is it stage appropriate? And have I been inclusive of different cultural responsibilities? Have I been inclusive of all ages, stages, abilities, and so forth as well? So moving through a framework and a theoretical framework. This is a framework that I'm sure you will all be familiar with, and it's a socio-ecological model. Often we speak about this model of the child's world, where the child is in the centre, and there's a lot of different impacting factors that are layered around the child. This is a really strong theory that we use often in our teaching when we talk about different contexts and how we establish different ways and pedagogies and practices within preschool environments. One way I'd like to look at this is, let's flip this around. Let's keep the children at the centre, but also let's think about, how does the child impact the layers around them? Rather than the layers impacting the child, let's think of how the child can be at the centre, and that how they can have an impact on all these other layers as well. So it's really giving children that advocacy. It's really giving children a sense of agency, and it's looking at the child from a different perspective. It's empowering the child, and it's allowing the child to really have an impact on the worlds around them, rather than their worlds having an impact on them. So when we do our research design, implementation, analysis, and discussion, let's flip this framework around. Let's think of it from the inside out and think about how the child can have a strong impact on everyone and everything around them as well. A little bit of novelty, but a different perspective on something that's very familiar to us. What I'd like to work through now is a little bit about some of the projects I've been involved in. In my PhD project, I was looking at children's physical activity in early childhood education and care services, and I was also looking at an educator's physical activity. This was actually achieved through the use of accelerometers, so actigraph accelerometers that the children and educators wore around their waist, and that measured the intensity of their stepping and their physical activity. And educators and children also wore a watch. This watch was like a GPS watch, and it was actually tracking their location around the space. What we were trying to achieve in this particular project was the comparison and the relationship between what was actually happening between educators and children, and how different environmental factors were influencing children's physical activity. One thing that was really important and was well considered in this project was that the educators were alongside the children in this research. So the children wore the equipment, and their familiar educators did so as well. This provided a really safe and secure environment, and the children felt more comfortable because they were doing so. I was also very conscious of spending time in the preschools and working with the children even before we started collecting our data. So we made it very play-based. I also went along and wore the watch and the accelerometer for a week prior to really engage the children in becoming familiar with what we would be doing. We made it play-based, and the children really responded well to this particular style of data collection, and they could actually see what was happening. Another thing that we did in the preschools was we actually developed a social story. So we developed images and pictures of what would be happening every day when I entered the service. So there were pictures of the watches, the accelerometers, but also what would be happening during their day while they were involved in this particular research. This was a really nice way of ensuring that children were familiar, felt comfortable, and also empowered that they were active participants in this research as well. Another project that I've been in is community consultation with Bernardo's Communities for Children. This particular project was really looking at hearing the ideas of the community to identify different strengths, areas of interest and opportunities, particularly for children and young people. This research, because we were affected by COVID disruptions, had to take a different angle. It was really important that we still worked alongside children to hear their voice, but we also felt it was important to hear the voices of those that are representing children as well. So we engaged quite closely with services, families, and the wider community to also hear their voice in this. The way that we approached the situation, because I couldn't have the face-to-face contact as I would like to have with children that are in the birth to 12 age group, we took our surveys online through SurveyMonkey, and we designed a survey that was very child-friendly, with pictures, with images, but also it really matched the surveys that we had designed for the families and community members as well. This actually meant that our whole community could respond to the surveys, and there was that shared understanding, and families could work closely with their children to help to work through the different surveys so that we could hear their voice in different ways as well. Another approach we took was we actually engaged in conversations with pre-existing groups, and this was an online group situation. So I was able to visit different groups within the Shellharbour area, and by doing so, I was able to be an active participant in their discussions, but then also lead some other discussion groups that would actually really meet the needs of our community consultation as well. Now, lastly, another project that I've been involved in is developing a child-friendly action plan in the Shellharbour LGA. So with this child-friendly action plan, this is going to be a framework for Shellharbour, and it was really important that we did speak to children birth to 12 years. The way of doing this was through drawings, conversations, and interactive activities. We actually saw that there was a need for us to be where the people and the children were. So I've engaged in various discussions with children and families in the local libraries and attended many of their local library programs. Once again, that was settling myself into a place where the participants already were. There was a sense of comfort, there was a sense of rapport, and I was becoming an active participant in what they were already doing. We engaged the children in a lot of different Lego play, and from that Lego play, we're able to really gather some of their discussion points as well. And the Lego was a very popular activity. We've also been to different events, and through that, we engaged the children in drawing, in discussions, and it was a whole family approach to what we took to that. We've also entered into schools where we've done particular activities and forums where we were able to enter into the child's safe space. And by activities and different interactive experiences, the children were able to share their voice in different ways as well. Now, I am going to skip past my next video, but something of interest is the City of Melbourne. The City of Melbourne have a project and a program called Big City Small Child Children's Forum. This is a very active and engaging forum that the children are involved in. It really gives them an active voice and a sense of agency in the development and the directions of their city, the City of Melbourne. It approaches the children's voice in a variety of different ways. So if you get the chance, it's certainly well worth the look. So just a final thought, and this is my final takeaway. So giving children a voice and engaging children in research is not simply about the opportunity to communicate ideas and opinions. It is about having the power to influence a change. And if we see children as powerful, if we see children as active agents in their communities, we're really going to be focusing research in the right direction, and we're really going to produce some really ethical and strong practices to get the best possible results as we want. Thank you.
Thanks, Karen. I couldn't agree more with that final thought. And I'm so glad that we're talking about children's voices and active engagement in research. In fact, that's going to be a theme that comes through my presentation as well, as I try and make that real in the context of the research that I do. Yeah, allow me to just share quickly. I'll work the technology, hopefully. Thumbs up, we're okay? Fantastic. Thank you very much. So when I was thinking about what to speak about today, there were any number of things that I thought we could talk about. In fact, the ARC Center of Excellence for the Digital Child is working up a green paper that is quite extensive, thinking about the different methodologies, the different considerations, ethical considerations around working with children. In terms of my own research, things that we've had to think really consciously and deeply about are things like parent and caregiver informed consent, but also ongoing child assent. Things like, how do we explain our ask to children? And more than just asking up front, saying, here's what we would like to involve you in, and are you happy to do this with us? What are the verbal and non-verbal cues as we continue on the research to watch for, to see if they're actually withdrawing their consent, even if they're not using those words or verbalizing it? So how do we ensure that ongoing child assent? I thought about some of the ethical considerations working in early childhood education and care settings. Some of those are things like a child's perception of whether we're a researcher or educator becomes blurred, and how do we navigate that and with our research hat on? But also we're mandatory reporters, and how do we navigate that responsibility in the context of our research? And particularly for some of the work that I'm doing, I know this is the case for all research always around data protection and confidentiality, anonymity, security. But a lot of the work that we do is around early assessments of young children's ability. So we have a responsibility for collecting, storing, and reporting appropriately data for more than 5,000 young children now in core abilities such as early numeracy and language and self-regulation. So how do we do that well? But like Karen, I wanted to shift the focus to something slightly different. And I'm so happy that we're talking about the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, particularly Article 12 that Karen introduced. This children's voices and active engagement in research. And I wanted to bring to life how we did that in one of our studies. Although full disclosure, I'm certainly not the expert on this topic. I am a learner and trying to get better with every single study we do. And the examples that you gave, Karen, were fantastic of that as well. But I did want to highlight that there is this ongoing shift in research, and I think it's a fantastic one, a shift towards approaches that recognize children as active contributors to the research, a shift towards methods that capture children's experiences and perspectives. And there's all sorts of different models to capture this child participation. How do we operationalize this? How do we do it? What are the things that we consider? This is one of them that the Center of Excellence, at least currently, is using as our framework for this working document, is Lundy's model of child participation. So it considers things like spaces, inclusive spaces, and safe spaces for children to express their opinions, to have their voices heard. Around voice, it considers things like giving children sufficient information for them to form a view and then be able to express that view. Around audience, we're asking questions like, does the child know who the audience is? And have we ensured that that audience has the power to make change, to enact whatever children's voices are saying? And then influence, is the child's voice considered and taken seriously? And Karen, you touched on a number of these as well. There's great overlaps there. My research revolves around early childhood abilities. A lot of it, but not exclusively, it's around child self-regulation. And when I talk about child self-regulation, what I mean is our ability to control our attention and our thinking, our behaviors, our social interactions, our emotional reactions in line with our goals, and to not get drawn by impulses or distractions that would lead us away from those goals. And we know early self-regulation is really important. So what we aim to do was develop a program to support young children's early self-regulation, really based on evidence that shows early childhood self-regulation from as early as age 3 is important, not only for their immediate learning and development, but very long-term as well. These are some findings from Terry Moffat and colleagues, a longitudinal study. And I'll say just quickly, they captured child self-regulation from 3 to 8 years of age, and then followed those children up when they were 32 years of age in a very longitudinal study. And they found that early childhood self-regulation was related to health, wealth, and criminality is what they called it. Health outcomes, number of injuries, number of hospital visits, whether you had credit problems, your income, your employment, school completion, whether you had encountered the criminal justice system, and things like substance use and abuse. And there's good theoretical reasons to believe why self-regulation should be implicated in these sorts of things, but it really emphasizes the point that this self-regulation ability is foundational for later outcomes. And we wanted to see what we could do to help support early self-regulation development. A lot of the programs that exist are quite burdensome, proprietary, costly. We wanted to come up with something that you could apply in an early childhood setting at low cost, low burden, that was flexible to the educators and the children. But more importantly, in getting back to the topic of today, a lot of those programs are developed without an educator or a child voice. It routinely focuses on research gain and what we know from the literature or what our suspicions are from our own experience and expertise. But the child voice is often silent in this program development, and then they're rolled out into these early childhood settings. We wanted to do it differently. So in designing our program, this was funded by an ARC DECRA, and it was the Early Start to Self-Regulation study, leveraging that Early Start name. And the first phase was we really wanted to know what was going on in the early childhood settings. So we wanted to observe all of the great practices that were already happening, and we wanted to talk to educators and children. So what are educators already doing to support self-regulation? What are the things that children are interested in? What are their patterns and preferences over the course of the day? And that suggested all sorts of things that we might be able to integrate into our program that would have potential self-regulation benefit that wouldn't have otherwise been on our radar. Things that just aren't in the published literature, but fantastic manifestations of how do we give children appropriate self-regulation challenge, but in a fun, playful, engaging way. So integrating that with what we did know from research, our second phase was a feasibility trial, where we had a whole range of activities and practices that we had educators trial and capture both educator and child voices in doing that. I'll give an example on the next slide. So in terms of the child voice, some of the things that we were interested in was children's ratings around whether they enjoyed the things, what their interests were. I put just a small capture of a child voice there, but it was really essential that we got both child and educator feedback to suggest new activities, again, that we hadn't even considered, to refine the ones that we had developed and thought might be appropriate, or to remove the ones that just didn't work the way that we anticipated for them to work. Just want to give two concrete examples of this influence bit of child participation. So what did we do with and about the child voice? There's a number of things, but two I want to draw to your attention. One was taking children's interests and trying to optimize those for a potential self-regulation benefit. One of the activities in a number of the services that were already happening and that the children really loved was musical statues, which you may be familiar with. The music plays and you dance, hopefully better than I'm dancing right now, and the music stops and you freeze. And what happens next? So the music freezes, and what does the educator or the facilitator of the game do? Everyone who didn't freeze, you're out of the game, and then we go again. So the children who are having the most trouble self-regulating, that is stopping the impulse to keep dancing when the music stops, we just gave the least opportunity to practice. We've removed them from the game, and it's the children who are already doing that quite well that get to continue in the game. Can we take those interests and modify them for optimal self-regulation benefit? So rather than removing children from the game, what if they don't freeze, they go down to their knees and we lose their legs from the equation of things that are moving? And if they don't freeze again, they sit on their bottom and remove their lower half from the equation. But then at the point that they do freeze, they get to move back up. We're not removing them from the game. We're still giving them that opportunity to practice. And we're making each iteration slightly easier, so it's an attainable, achievable level of self-regulation challenge. One of the other things that we did was, how do we deliver these activities? How do we make them engaging and help children's investment in doing these activities? What's the common thread? And story time was a vehicle that came through in those discussions. So what we did in terms of these activities is we threaded them through children's storybooks, a picture book with a narrative, a story narrative, but at each juncture throughout the story, there's a game that children can play that is much like what the character did in the story. It's a thread that we can engage children in these activities. So these are just two examples of how we integrated children's voices as well as educators' voices into our program design. And from there, I'll just say we did a program implementation. I won't go into all of the findings because that's beside the point for our purposes today. But we did implement and evaluate that program with 50 preschools across the state and 473 children to really quite positive effect. One of the things that we ensured at the end of the program, as you can see here, is that we were communicating back to participating children, families, educators, what it is we did, what it is we found, and what the next steps might be if they want to leverage the benefits of that program. Anyways, a small snapshot of some of the ways that we've enacted that child voice and active engagement in research. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can work out where the button is, and I'm going to hand over to Natascha. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stephen. So let me start sharing. Okay, is that all good? All right, fantastic. So I'm going to speak primarily from the perspective of my role as the current chair of the Social Sciences Human Research Ethics Committee. So I've been in that role since 2020, and I've been a member of the committee for a couple of years before that as well. I'm also an academic in the School of Geography and Sustainable Communities at UAW, and I have experience going back to my own PhD of doing research involving children and young people. So my PhD focused on, it was a participatory and action-oriented research project with child domestic workers in Tanzania. So I've long thought about children's participation in research, both as part of my own work and through the ethics role. But today the focus will be on ethics because I think that's what's potentially of most use to the audience. So it's quite interesting that I think Karen and Stephen and I have all made a very similar point quite early in our presentation, and that is about the ethics of including children in research in the first place. And I think views about this have shifted enormously over the last couple of decades. So the assumption used to be that including children in research places an undue burden on them and that this was unethical, and you kind of had to work to justify the importance of including children of research. But that's totally flipped now. And now we're very much in a position where the view is that excluding children from research that has impacts on their lives is unethical, rather than the issue of including them. So I think that's been a really important shift that has been influenced by the United Nations Declaration, as Stephen's mentioned. As you probably know, our ethics committees, when we're doing our reviews, are required to assess applications against the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research. And so what I thought I'd do today is talk through some of the key considerations in there relating to research with children and let you know the types of things that the Ethics Committee looks out for in relation to those points when we're reviewing applications. So the national statement has a section on children and young people, and it's definitely worth familiarising yourself with that if you aren't already familiar with it. The key considerations they outline, the key ethical considerations when doing research with children and young people, are their capacity to understand the research and so to consent to participate, the possible risk of coercion by parents, peers, and other people in relationships of influence over the children, and potentially in some circumstances, conflicting values and interests between parents and children. So it might be that I think this tends to come to the fore more in medical research, which is not my area of expertise because I'm the social sciences HREC. But for example, if you think about parents wanting a particular intervention for the child and the child not wanting it, or vice versa. So I think this becomes most heated in the medical space, but still that dependent parent-child relationship is an important thing to consider in consent for research. So in terms of the first of those points, the capacity to consent, things that we look for as an HREC, first of all, are the age of the child. Now, the national statement doesn't set any clear ages for really anything to do with consent, which is a good thing because we do understand that children's to consent isn't necessarily determined by an age cutoff, but it's also a little bit unhelpful for ethics committees because it means we have to come to our own positions on these things over time and to think about, you know, at what age children can consent independently in the absence of a clear age limit in the national statement. So the national statement gets us to think about different groupings. So there's infants who are so young that they can't take part in a discussion about the research in a meaningful way and so can't consent to it. Then you've got young children, which would be a lot of who people in Early Start conduct their research with, who can certainly understand some information about the research, but are not required to consent. And what we then look for is that you get parental consent, but you still get children's assent is basically the child's agreement. It doesn't have any formal legal standing in the way that consent does, but it's the child's agreement that they are happy to participate. And that's something that's really important. And often the committee, if people haven't already included it, will ask you not only to include a consent form for the parent, but some kind of assent script. What are you going to say to kids when you're introducing the research to them to check that they're cool with it, that they're happy to go ahead, that they want to participate? So that's something we often prompt people to include if you haven't already done so. The next group would be kids of developing maturity, is what the national statement says, who can understand about the research, but they're still vulnerable potentially for other reasons, partly due to dependent relationships and so on. So they might still not be able to make an independent decision about their participation. So in this case, what we ask people to seek is parental consent because it's still needed formally for legal purposes, but also children's consent. So what we tend to suggest there is potentially a consent form that's written in child appropriate language that both parents and children can sign together, or separate consent forms for the two. So the parent signs first and then there's a separate consent process for the kid. In addition to that, to make sure that they also consent. And again, there's no clear-cut boundary. In my own research, I tend to apply this to the 10 to 15 age group. I tend to get them to provide written consent in addition to their parents' consent. So I've got a project at the moment with refugee youth where that's the age cutoff I'm putting in place for children to provide that written consent as well. And then there's older children. So here we're thinking 16 plus who potentially are able to consent independently from their parents. It depends a bit on the topic of the research. So in some cases, parental consent won't be needed at all for these older children. But none of these boundaries are clear cut and they depend on the children involved. They depend on the sensitivity of the research topic and what's being requested, and they depend on the location. So in most school-based research, the school will still require parental consent to be in place, even for children aged 16 and above. So there's a lot of things that we consider, but these are some of the factors that come into play when we're thinking about that consent process. We also think about things and look for things like the clarity of the written documents, so that the participant information sheets and consent forms and things like that are in age-appropriate language. We try to make sure that the staging of the consent and assent process makes sense. So sometimes that can be quite confusing because there's lots of stages. So often, for example, it might be the school principal or the early childhood centre director needs to consent first, and then it's the parents who consent, and then you go through some kind of consent or assent process with the child. So that staging needs to make sense. There's no point asking the child first and then working back in the other direction, because if the centre director says no, then you can't do it anyway, or if the school principal says no. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Also, strategies to monitor ongoing consent or assent from children, and that's something that Karen also reflected on. She spoke about responsiveness. So just this awareness that for all research participants, adult and child, consent is dynamic. It's not where you sign a form and then that's it. So we need to consistently monitor that the child is still keen to participate, and if it's clear to us that they're no longer assenting or consenting, then we need to have strategies for letting them get out of the research situation if that's what they want to do. I did want to just make flag, and I am speaking a little bit about schools today, even though I know a lot of early start research happens in early childhood. I know it often bleeds into the school setting as well. So I do want to talk a little bit about school. Something that sometimes comes up with research in schools is this idea of opt-out consent, which is the idea of sending home a note to parents and saying this research is happening. If you don't return this form to opt out, then your child will be included in it. We generally don't like to approve that kind of consent. And the reason is that, as we all know, notes get lost all the time. And so opt-out consent in that kind of setting can be quite a tricky thing. So I just did want to flag that for people who are doing research in school contexts. With regard to dependent relationships, we look out for things like opportunities for children to provide their consent or assent separately in addition to their parents. So as I've already mentioned, parents might sign a consent form, but the child is read a verbal assent script before the actual research activity takes place, to check that they're interested in participating and to make it clear that they're allowed to say no. So even though their parent has said yes, if they don't want to do this thing right now, they can say no. And monitoring ongoing consent also assists with this, which is what I just spoke about a moment ago. Other dependent relationships. So in addition to the parent-child relationship, other dependent relationships we're thinking about, probably the one we spend a lot of time thinking about is the school teacher and student relationship. And so what I'm going to talk about just for the next 2 slides is probably more relevant to schools than early childhood context. And that teacher-student dependent relationship is one that we tend to be quite careful around. So generally, teachers shouldn't be the people conducting research on their students or necessarily collecting consent forms from them on behalf of researchers, because that can complicate that teacher-student dependent relationship, which can make kids feel pressure to participate. If research relates to a school activity, we often will ask the researchers to make it clear whether that activity is going to be available to the students, even if they don't consent to participate in the research. So ideally, the students should be able to take part in the activity along with everyone, even if their parent potentially hasn't consented to the research. It just means that their part won't be included in the data set, because we don't want situations where kids are kind of being isolated and separated off or left out of an activity. It needs to be really clearly explained in school contexts that not participating in research won't impact student marks or their outcomes in any way. And we need to take care that participating students, those who participate in the research, aren't given any academic advantages or other advantages over other cohorts of students. So if you had one class in a school being given a particular activity that was going to potentially improve their academic outcomes and that wasn't given to the other students in other classes, then that wouldn't be fair. So that's something we also look for, the fairness of who has access to the research activities. Some other things to think about, and I think children and privacy is really important. And I think, the first thing obviously is to give parents and children quite clear choices over how their names might be used in research or not, and also how any photos of them will be used. And I think particularly given growing concerns about photos of children being online, concerns about the datification of children, I think it's always useful for researchers to ask themselves whether the purpose of the research can be served with a photo that doesn't allow the child to be identified. So whether that's through taking the photo from an angle where you can't see the child's face, or potentially blurring techniques and things like that. I think if it's not necessary to the purpose of the research to show a child in an identifiable way, then we really need to think carefully about whether it's something we should be doing or not. Reciprocity and benefit. This is something we also often look for, and the national statement very much prompts us to evaluate the risk of any research against the benefit of the research. So the first questions really is if the research can be designed to be of immediate benefit to the children involved. If not, what other forms of reciprocity might you show? So sometimes it might be something little like a very small gift for children. Sometimes it might be, you get them to do a drawing activity and you let them keep the drawing materials you've given them. It can be all sorts of little things just to provide some kind of reciprocity to the children for the time that they're giving to our research. So that's something you might also be prompted to think about by the ethics committee if it's not already in your research design. And the last thing I think I wanted to just briefly talk about, which is quite a big topic, is research that involves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So in addition to the national statement, if your research involves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, you need to consult with the IATSIS code. So often there's that question on the ethics form that asks you about cultural considerations to your research. And we prompt researchers now to be quite specific in terms of, okay, so please look at the IATSIS code and let us know how these different principles are going to be operationalized in your research. So some of the principles outlined in the IATSIS code include things like Indigenous self-determination, Indigenous leadership, impact and value, and sustainability and accountability. If you're doing research that involves Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and is related to their health and well-being, you may also, in addition to approval from the UOWH, need approval from the Aboriginal Health and Medical Research Council. So normally what would happen is our HREC would approve something and then that application would go to the AH&MRC Ethics Committee for them to review also. And then we would need to receive confirmation that they've reviewed and approved the research once that's completed. Something we're increasingly thinking about as a committee in regards to research involving Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and participants more generally is that the risk of stereotyping in the way that the results are reported. So you'll probably increasingly find that we will be asking researchers to think a bit about how they're going to report on their results. And if they're disaggregating data for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and, analysing that as compared to data for the non-Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in the study, then if comparisons are being made there, how are they going to be made sensitively so that we're not risking further stereotyping groups, individual groups? And that would apply to research with migrants as well from various backgrounds. An example I like to give people with that stereotyping, and I'll wrap up after this, is often even, the research instruments we use are biased to start off with. They were designed, for use with Anglo-European children in many cases. And so that then sets up a situation where children who aren't of that background are potentially being evaluated against a yardstick that doesn't meet their cultural needs in the first place. And then when they get shown to perform poorly against that yardstick, that's taken as a measure of deficiency somehow. So I think we all need to get better at thinking about, are our research instruments culturally inclusive? And when we disaggregate groups according to their ethnicity in our research findings, how can we make sure that we do that in a way that is sensitive and that doesn't exacerbate stereotypes? Okay, so that's a kind of big kind of can of worms topic to leave us on, but I will stop there and I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Natascha and Stephen and Karen. What terrific insights you've given us. There were some interesting threads that came across the conversation as each of you presented. Karen, you talked about the importance of communication. Stephen, you talked about having to explain our ask to children and drew our attention to verbal and non-verbal there. And Natascha, you talked about how to get consent and the importance of the assent script, and highlighted for us the importance of not coercing our participants to give their consent. So just by way of conclusion, and the benefit for us is that you are all here at UAW, so anyone who has direct questions can follow those up with you. But I'm just wondering if you could just finish our session with each of you providing for us just a tip around how to introduce a project to children, and how do you know that they've provided their consent to you, even if it's after you've read the assent script. So a tip for introducing a project, and how do you know that they're okay with it? Steve, we'll start with you.
Thanks, Lisa. I think I find it's different in different contexts and different projects, but there are some commonalities that might come out across us. First, I think we need to use language that's very accessible, introducing who we are and what it is we're doing in a very accessible way. And then clearly, but simply, the sorts of things that we're asking the children to get involved in, and genuinely asking them if they'd like to do those things with us. As we're going through, there's all sorts of, and in my research, I find it's often more nonverbal cues to suggest that children might be disengaging. That is, increasing distraction, or I'd like to go have something to eat, I'm hungry. It might not be I don't want to participate in this project or this research anymore. It's typically not. So being very sensitive to a child no longer being interested, involved, as attentive to the things that you want is a really good sign that they're trying to withdraw their participation.
Terrific. Thanks, Steve. Karen, what are you thinking?
Yeah, great question. Nice and short and sweet. I would probably say introducing the research, make it play-based. Let's play with children. Let's really develop that rapport through play-based pedagogy and practice, and make it playful. In getting that indication as to whether children no longer want to participate, I would say it's about that relationship that you've built up, that understanding perhaps, and that observation, and being responsive to the children's cues, and just understanding how children are going to communicate with you at whatever age it might be, and really reflecting upon what you're watching and seeing at that particular point in time, and knowing when to step away and when the children have had enough of that participation. Yeah.
Thanks. And Natascha?
I think my comments will be very similar. I think working with children actually teaches us a lot about how we can explain our research in more simple, straightforward terms, and it's probably the same terms we should be using when describing it to adults. I think we're often unnecessarily complicated in describing our research. So I think we could almost work backwards from what would it take for a young person to understand this, and why don't we just give everyone the courtesy of describing our research in those terms? And in terms of how you know if a child wants to participate, I think this is a really interesting thing to think through when working with culturally diverse populations, which is what a lot of my research is, because in a lot of cultural groups, you might not, there's very much a deferential relationship between children and adults, and it can be harder to say no. So we probably need to adjust what we're looking for when we're working with children from diverse backgrounds as well. And I think for me, what's really important is that if you're noticing those nonverbal cues, that you're the one to give them a way out. You're not waiting for them to be brave enough to pipe up and say, actually, I'd like to stop. If you notice it, you say, hey, would you rather do something else? Have you had enough of this for now? Like, give them a gentle way out rather than expecting them to be brave and take that on with you. Yeah.
And let's face it, sometimes we all need a gentle way out, right? And on that note, a gentle way out for all of us is that our hour has passed. So thank you to Stephen, Natascha and Karen for sharing your insights and taking time to have these conversations with us. Natascha, you've given us so many hints too, so I hope that you see improved quality of ethics applications from us at Early Start, and really happy to keep those conversations going with you around what we can do to support the very important work that you are doing on our behalf and for all the participants that we work with. And a reminder to those who come to these sessions often is that in December, we are having our last session for the year. Hard to believe that the year has passed already. And we're going to be focusing on working with large data sets. So that seminar is scheduled for 11:30 on Tuesday, the 6th of December. So thanks, everybody, and we'll see you soon.